Welcome to part 2. We're going to talk about the nitty-gritty details as far as how I got the engine and transmission into this truck. There are a number of adapter kits to adapt pretty much any rear-wheel drive GM transmission to the factory transfer case. I used a company called Mark's 4-Wheel Drive. They're located in Australia. That was probably the single most expensive part of this conversion. It was basically it's just an aluminum housing that goes from the 6L80 or whatever transmission of your choice to the factory transfer case, as well as a spline shaft. Now, in my situation, I had to cut off a couple inches off the end of the output shaft on the transmission, which wasn't too hard. It's actually pretty soft metal compared to other output shafts that I've had to modify, like Jeeps and stuff. But the instructions were very straightforward. It went in like it really went together like it was designed to go together, not like somebody made it in their garage and said, hope for the best, fingers crossed. Anyway, I did run into one small issue. The 4-wheel drive shifter mounts to the top of the supplied housing, and this is the original 4-wheel drive shifter from this truck. The bolt pattern on the 1 of 95 and later 80 series Land Cruiser is different than the one that fits the adapter. So if you're planning on using this particular adapter, and the others might be different, I really have zero experience with them. If you're planning on using a 1 of 95 and later truck with a 6L80 adapter, you need an early shifter. Thankfully, at that time, I had a 93 Land Cruiser parts truck. I robbed the shifter off the transmission, and everything just went together perfectly. The linkage is in the right spot. There's really no adjustment. I would definitely recommend you lubricate all of the joints because they get pretty dry. Alright, here it is mounted in the truck. As you can see, it uses the original cross member, the original transmission mount. It actually is a pretty well made piece. Can I get a little closer? There's the 6L80, there's the adapter piece, and there's the factory transfer case. Again, you have to use a 93 through 12 of 94 shifter if you intend on using this particular adapter. I searched the internet for that information, and thankfully the only way I figured it out is that I had a parts truck. Now, in part 1 of the first video, I mentioned that I used a transmission sourced from a Pontiac G8. If you intend on doing that, I have a couple recommendations for you. The G8 has a shallow transmission pan. The Tahoe and the SUV and Silverado, all the bigger vehicles, SUVs, those all use a much deeper pan, as well as the filter being a little deeper to accommodate for the lower pan. The G8 uses a fill plug like all of the other 6L transmissions, whereas the one in the trucks and SUVs uses a dipstick tube, which is a much easier way to fill the transmission and a much more reliable way of checking the transmission fluid level. So as far as some other transmission tidbits, the transmission cooler lines are from a G8. The truck lines don't fit the F-body oil pan that you need to run. So my best advice is to find the transmission lines from a G8. I'm sure there's other vehicles you can use them from. You will have to massage them into place. They're actually not where they need to be because the transmission pan is off of it. As well, if you do buy a G8 transmission and you do wish to install the deeper pan and filter, the pan you can buy directly from the Tahoe or an Escalade or a Denali. But please note, use an 09 and later transmission. The 7 and 8 transmission for the trucks uses a different oil pan. It's an entirely different transmission case. Will not work. I'll show you that here now. Alright, here's both transmission pans. The front one is the G8, it's the shallow pan. The rear one is from an 07 Escalade. As you can see, the truck pan is significantly deeper. It holds, I think, about 1.5 quarts more fluid. The really nice thing besides the larger capacity is the fact that you can use a factory dipstick tube. Now, if you're going to decide to run a G8 transmission and you want the deeper pan, you have to find an 09 up Tahoe or Silverado or any of that full-size truck or SUV. That's the correct pan. You can see the flange difference is here. That's the correct gasket for the transmission, and that is the incorrect pan. And here's the factory dipstick tube from, I think it's from an 07 Escalade, but either way, 07 to 13 or 14 SUV, right before they got to the direct injection stuff. That dipstick tube, it just fits right in where the fill plug does on the 6L80. Another question you may have is, as far as how do we get the speedometer to work? So
The really nice thing about the 6L80 is the 6L80 has its own output speed sensor, so that tells the PCM this is when this is critical information as far as shift points. But the factory Land Cruiser is run off of the transfer case, which retains the original vehicle speed sensor here, and everything just plugs in the right place. The drive shafts mount in the perfect location, so once you get the adapter installed, everything fits just perfect. It's just like a glue there. Alright, so as far as an oil pan is concerned, I mentioned earlier in the video that I decided to use the F-body oil pan. It is the rear sump oil pan. There's good and bad things about that. The good news about that is they're kind of plentiful. You can buy them new. You can buy whole kits for about $350, $400. Comes with all the bolts, the gasket, the pickup tube, the windage tray, everything you need. The bad news about it is that it does not hold that much fluid. But we don't really have an option. If you want to leave the room for the suspension travel, you really need this small pan on here. I'm sure there's some aftermarket pans that'll fit, but as far as I know, this is the only factory pan that will fit. I bought this pan. It's a Chinese Dorman pan. It does not fit very good. I would not recommend you go that route. I try to find a factory pan or a used pan if you can do that. And I mentioned that this kit came with motor mount brackets, and as you can see, way up there's the motor mount bracket, well, at least the driver's side that was supplied. It bolts onto any Gen 3 or Gen 4 block. There's nothing special to do. You just pretty much bolt them on. They do supply the bolts and hardware. I'm not a big fan of like Allen or hex head bolts. I find that that's probably the worst type of fastener you can use. So I use factory bolts because, well, I've seen them on 400,000 mile Chevy trucks, so why not this truck too? Alright, if you wish to retain AC, you're going to have to do one frame modification. Now, the nice thing about this is if you ever decide to go backwards, if you ever decide to put the original engine back in, the part of the frame that you need to modify and cut off is totally unused with the original engine. I guess they made one frame for a lot of these vehicles and with different engines and overseas like the diesel. So I suppose that's probably a mount for that. In this situation, you just literally shorten. As you can see, it's kind of hard to get back here. You cut this section off and you shorten it, and that allows the factory GM AC compressor to fit right there. As well, another thing on this oil pan, it doesn't have a dipstick tube. So whatever block you decide to use, I think I mentioned this in my first video, now make sure it has a provision for the dipstick. Some blocks don't have that, and that is going to cause you to drill unless you use an aftermarket pan, which I'm not quite sure what fits. So that's your prerogative, but just a word to the wise, find a block with a dipstick hole. Now, as far as going in with your engine and transmission, once you have the engine and transmission together, the transfer case adapter, and I decided to install it all together without the transfer case. I don't think you can get the transfer case and everything in the right spot without destroying your truck. I'm sure someone has, but I wasn't willing to do that. Once the drivetrain was in, I had to shim the passenger side engine mount. It really, the crankshaft wasn't centered and I wanted my driveshaft angle correct. As well, before I even got to that point, you have to take a hammer or a mallet or a block of wood or some other blunt object, your neighbor's bricks, whatever it might be, and you have to beat in the firewall right here. Not very far, but try not to beat it in on one point because you can actually split the metal as it gets too thin. Kind of just go around the area. The way that firewall is shaped kind of like this, and what you're doing is you're flattening this side of it. That's where that passenger cylinder head has to go. As well, as you're going in with this, make sure that this drivetrain is as stripped as possible. No intake manifold, no coils, no exhaust manifolds, and no accessories. You're going to be just fighting with everything if you decide to install this complete. As well, you're probably going to tear some stuff up. Before I end, I'd really like to talk about some of the issues I've had that could be avoided depending on the transmission choice. Now, I really wanted to use the 6L80. That's the transmission I have in my Tahoe. That truck gets 20 miles to the gallon. It shifts pretty good, sometimes like a drunken sailor, but that's for another reason. Regardless, I needed that extra 2 gears over the 4L60 and 4L80, which required me to run a drive-by-wire throttle body, convert the engine to 58X. There's a whole slew of things I had to do, change the gas pedal, run an electric gas pedal actually. keep that in mind with your transmission choice if you're wanting to get this done quickly. I think it'd be much cheaper to run a 4L60 or a 4L80. You can find those in the salvage yard pretty easily. Again, I'm very stubborn, so I want what I want, and I'm paying the price because my truck still isn't done. Anyway, tune in to more, subscribe. There's going to be a part 3 pretty soon. Thanks, guys.